the 10,000 hour rule, popularized by Malcolm Gladwell. What is it, and can it be applied when it comes to learning software engineering? Is this rule founded upon science, or is it just a misinterpretation? This podcast, I go over some of the ways that this concept can actually hurt the learning process for aspiring software engineers. My name is Kang, and welcome back to another episode of Becoming a Software Engineer. All right. So, for those of you who have already learned about the 10,000 hour rule from Malcolm Gladwell's famous book, Outliers, bear with me while I very quickly recap what the 10,000 hour rule is all about. So, one of the main points that Gladwell makes is that when he takes a look at all the people that we think are fundamentally gifted or fundamentally experts, one thing we find is that these folks spent an extraordinarily long time becoming this quote-unquote expert. If you actually add up the hours, it actually took 10,000 hours for them to become this expert. In terms of intention, I think there's nothing too wrong about this. Generally, folks want to believe that they can get something very quickly. They give up too early, and as a result, they never get to become the expert that they could have become. And of course, if you just say, hey, you should take a long time and focus, that's not really convincing. And so a more marketable way to say this would be, hey, it takes 10,000 hours. Have you considered what that means? If you did 40 hours a week, perhaps that would take about 5 years of full-time dedication for you to become an expert. Now, I have seen this used in the context of software engineering for quite a long time. And if I were to be very honest, I actually think that it has hurt the industry more than it helped when it comes to learning. So first, let's talk about kind of the details. Now, the 10,000 hour rule is fundamentally based on Professor Ericsson's research. Professor Ericsson is very famous for some of the studies that he did. A bunch of canonical studies talking about the study of experts and really how do you become an expert and whatnot. Really famous professor when it comes to the field of psychology. And so Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule, the scientific portion that is backing up the 10,000 hour rule was Professor Ericsson's study. Now, what's interesting is that Professor Ericsson largely disagreed with a lot of what Gladwell actually talks about, because Gladwell talks about 10,000 hours. But if you actually look at the complexity of the task that you're trying to become an expert in, there's no way that you can say that it always takes 10,000 hours, even if it was a figurative speech, because quite literally, the very first study that really made Professor Ericsson popular was the study of a normal person who came in and just needed to memorize a bunch of digits. So, if I ask you to memorize a bunch of random digits, you might at best do, somewhere between 5 to 7. Maybe you're great. Maybe you do 9 random digits that you can remember. But what Professor Ericsson did was, he brought this person in and really tried to push the limit. So this person at some point was, memorizing 50 random digits that were kind of given to him. And that was an amazing achievement. But over the course of 450 hours, roughly, he was able to, memorize, I believe it was hundreds of digits, which is just absolutely radical. And so do note that the complexity of the task of memorizing digits is not as complex as, let's say, becoming a good communicator or becoming a good programmer. And so as such, you don't have a situation where, people took 10,000 hours to become this quote unquote expert. And mind you, this was, so to speak, like a world record holding level of memorization at the time. And so definitely you can categorize this person as an expert. So the 10,000 hour rule in itself is kind of funny because, when you look at those music students who went on to become world famous musicians, some of them spent, half the amount of time, while some of them spent 25,000 hours. There was nothing really inherent to the 10,000 hour mark that you can really say you became an expert. And this is an obvious truth. Just play a thought game in your mind. When it comes to something extremely simple, like knowing the answer to 1 + 1, well, I mean, if you think about that, it's, how long does it take for you to become an expert at that? Obviously not 10,000 hours. But, how long would it take for you to become an expert at being a crime scene investigator? Maybe it takes longer than 10,000 hours, right? How long does it take for you to be really good at hitting a home run? Maybe it takes longer than 10,000 hours. Maybe it takes shorter, right? And so depending on the complexity of the task, the number of hours can change. But also, and this is actually the more important part, and that kind of leads to point number 2. It's not just the complexity of the task that determines the length of how long it takes. It actually has a lot to do with the teacher and the direction that the student is getting. And it's unfortunate that Malcolm Gladwell didn't really touch upon this too much because this was actually Ericsson's main point. So it's almost like you're using a study, but you're almost missing the main point in the study. And the main point was that there's different types of practicing. Ericsson, one time he talked about how, if you were playing doubles tennis with your friends and there was a very specific backhand swing that you did, and let's say you missed. And now the question is like, how are you approaching your practice? Because you can just kind of play with your friends for a couple of years, or upon realizing that you missed, you can drill constantly that backhand swing and get better and better, which is obviously way better. But even better than that would be to get a teacher who has gone through this himself, herself, and has actually helped so many people in the process of bettering their backhand swing. And so in this professor's word, and mind you, professors are interested in the truth of the matter. That's why they became scientists in the first place. In this professor's words, you could play for 2 years and be roughly the same as somebody who got lessons for 2 hours when it comes to that one backhand swing. And so the method in which how you practice, he said naive practice, when you go in and you're not really exploring your limits, will really not take you anywhere near as far. And really, you will never become an expert if you just keep doing naive practice. Not as far as purposeful practice and deliberate practice. And there's a little bit of a difference between purposeful and deliberate, but I'm just going to bunch the two into one big bucket, which is, making practice all about going to the limit and getting specific guidance from an expert. And so if you're not getting that kind of guidance, then you may actually never become an expert. So why is this important? Well, it shapes what you're going to be doing over a long period of time. And actually, getting this right entirely changes how you approach your practice in the first place. Going back to that tennis example, if you really wanted to become good, to the degree where you're going to get paid to play tennis, well, then you can't just go to a tennis court and expect to play casually. Even if you play casually for a long time, you will literally never make it. And why? Because you're not doing purposeful, or better yet, you're not doing deliberate practice. You're doing the worst one, which is naive practice. And so I would largely disagree with folks when it comes to this idea that all you have to do is sit down and kind of code, kind of learn this and that. It's not enough to approach it in a way where you think to yourself, oh, I don't need any positive external pressure. I don't need anyone who knows anything more than me to really guide me in any direction. I just need to sit down and kind of learn at my own pace. And the reason why that's not good is that is really the definition of naive practice. What you really want to be doing is the opposite. You want somebody to look at, what you're good at, what you're not good at, and then give you not just the critique, but also the very specific lessons that help you to make your weakness your strength. There's a very big difference between going to the basketball court every day and kind of shooting, kind of getting better, versus going to the basketball, playing one game, and then, to your amazing luck, the basketball coach of your city, let's say, is there, and he just says, look, here's your greatest weakness. Your shots are bad. Your dribble's not bad. It could improve. Your passing's not bad. It can improve. But you don't have the triple threat. You don't have a good shot. And so let's work on the shot. Let's do 500 shots right now and give you feedback on each of those shots. That is very different. And again, in the words of Ericsson himself, 2 years of naive practice might not account any of the learnings that you really need. And that's why 2 hours of deliberate practice is always going to be good. And so when Ericsson was talking about people becoming experts, he was talking very specifically about deliberate practice. And as a learning software engineer, I'd have to ask you, which practice are you doing? And I need to say this right now. It's so much better that you're doing some form of practice compared to not doing any practice. So if you woke up in the morning and you decided, hey, I'm going to do some naive practice on my own, that is so much better than doing nothing. But now, if we're going to take this to a more measured approach, if we said you need to become an expert, how should you do it? Should you just meet up with folks that are roughly your level and, so to speak, rally around? Or should you be more measured? And the answer is always that you should be more measured. You should always have somebody who's already been through the forest, so to speak, and has come out of the forest, and you can see it in this person's boots. They've got mud all over their boots, so to speak. And this person says, hey, let me take you through the forest, but I want you to avoid that little lake or pond over there. And over here is really slippery. And I can tell from your shoes, we're going to have to watch out for ABC. And that kind of expert guidance, and I would say it's actually more than mentoring. Mentoring is kind of similar to somebody who's better than you playing with you. And that's great. If they really want you to get better, they will make a comment or two. And that's going to be way better than nothing. But what you need is more than mentoring. You need a coach. You need a coach that's going to take a vested interest in you and your development over a long period of time. And I think that's the piece that we're not looking for enough. Why? Because again, when we think 10,000 hour rule, we never were aware in the first place after reading Malcolm Gladwell's book that the style of 10,000 hour is of pivotal importance. Now, here's one really good thing. You're not discovering programming on your own. If you think about an expert's blog, that's a certain amount of coaching. Where the blog might be lacking is feedback. So it's a one-way discussion. There's no opportunity to see you code and then make the critiques. So to speak, this is similar to watching somebody make a nice swing and at least trying to imitate it. That's way, way, way better than never seeing a proper swing in your life and just swinging the way you want to make the swing. And you can think of that as like tennis or golf or whatnot on a metaphorical level. Okay, so that's way better. But what would be better is for you to see it, for you to imitate it, and probably what I mean to say is the majority of the actual benefit percentage is coming from the fact that you get to do the swing and the coach gets to give you the critique. The coach gets to record what you're doing. You get to see what you thought you were doing but you're not doing, and then you get to make changes. That is deliberate practice, right? And being able to know that, this is a weakness in your game and you got to get better, that's the big deal. So the piece that is missing, and this is a huge one, is code review and pair programming. And this is just an obvious thing. If you get the chance to have a coach that actually takes a vested interest in your education across not just a couple of months, but a couple of years, really, to pair program with you, to identify what your weaknesses are, tell you where to improve, to see how you are in action within a given specific time frame of 1 hour, sometimes a specific time frame of 1 week, to see if you can do things independently. That's where the value is at, right? If you think about it, the value is not at the simple decision to be coding. The value is not that we meet up with friends and kind of code together. Because again, you could do 2 years of that naive practice and not achieve what you could just do in 2 hours. And so there's something extremely incorrect about thinking about the 10,000 hour rule as if every hour is equal to each other, when Ericsson was the one who pointed to the large gap between naive practice and deliberate practice. The gap being so large that no amount of naive practice would be able to achieve what deliberate practice can achieve. And so, you don't want to be thinking, oh yeah, I'll put in my hours. Putting in your hours is obvious. In anything, if you want to be good, you have to put in your hours, right? So we need to go beyond this. We can't just be thinking, oh yeah, I'll put in my hours. Yes, everybody's putting in their hours, but in every single profession out there, you wouldn't say, hey, yeah, I'll put in my hours. I'll do my shots, and of course I'll enter the NBA. Oh yeah, I'll do my swings, and I'll be a pro golfer, no problem. No, it's not about putting in our hours. In fact, if you go to a golf teacher, a golf coach, and you told this coach, hey, I've been actually practicing swings on my own, and I've been practicing for like 4 or 5 months by myself. Would you like to coach me? This person is guaranteed going to feel worse that you've been learning on your own for 4 and 5 months, as opposed to learning with a person that is actually good and can help you. And why? Because now you have to unlearn all the bad things that you did learn. And that actually makes it even harder, right? And so, programming is perhaps slightly different in that what you do learn, it's great that you're learning it. It is always stacking. But the truth is, the manner in which how are you learning is such a big deal that there's no way that somebody's 10,000 hours is equal to another person's 10,000 hours. In fact, according to Ericsson, there will be many people who spend 10,000 hours and all they're doing is spending their lives, doing weak practice and being much, much worse than another person who spends 1,000 hours that's way more measured. And just think about it. If I spent 10,000 hours memorizing digits in the wrong way, that's very, very different from Ericsson's first study of that one person who came in and learned to memorize hundreds of digits randomly. In fact, the big part of Ericsson's study was that when the next people came in and got advice and coaching from this person who is now the expert, they ended up doing better. Again, Ericsson's largest focus was not, hey, look, it takes 450 hours for you to memorize many random digits. It was the fact that if you can get guidance and if you can push the limit, if you can have somebody who's been through it guiding you, then you can do amazing things. And yes, of course, it takes time. So do you see where it would help for us to not focus so much on the 10,000 hour mark? Not only is the number of hours itself kind of funny because it's dependent on the complexity of the task at hand, but also because you don't want to be thinking that plugging in the hours is what's actually going to make the difference. It's actually the deliberate practice itself. There's one more example that I can actually give you. If you go to the gym and let's say it's really tough for you to lift, 30 pounds dumbbell or whatever. What happens if you go and just lift 5 pounds? Do you make any progress whatsoever? The answer is no. And why? Well, the thing about exercise is that you need to be pushing your limit for you to make progress beyond you. You need to be constantly telling your body that you require more of your body. And what happens is that your body will take a hit and then it will recover and it will become stronger, but only because you pushed the limit. So the question is now, how do you know your own limit? Well, for exercise, you know your limit by the amount of sweat that you have. So, I mean, that's, first of all, what makes a person's exercise better versus worse, right? When you're serious about exercising, you look at the amount of sweat that you have on your t-shirt. You almost see that as a sign of progress. Right? That's something you're proud of. Whereas when you're not serious about it, you go to the gym and you have a little sweat and you're thinking, okay, this is not good. I don't like the sweat. And you stop right away, right? And so the quality of your workout is dependent on how serious you are about pushing your limit. And whereas for workout, it might make a little more sense. Of course, one of the problems with workout is that as you push your limit, you might have the entirely wrong form in terms of what you're lifting or how you're running or whatnot. And this is where an expert can help you. But even more so would be something as invisible as the work that your brain does, right? So again, you need to make sure that you're pushing the limit and that you're getting expert guidance. And if you do that, it won't take 10,000 hours for you to get a job, right? And really, it's at your job where you learn more and more and become an expert over time. But it won't take 10,000 hours. That's such an arbitrary number. You shouldn't think like that at all. You should be focusing on having a very good day today. And a good day today means that you need to have guidance from an expert who has a vested interest in you, and you need to push the limits and know what you're trying to improve at. Very specific tasks, one at a time. And one last important point here is that, unfortunately, the 10,000 hour rule does not help us to think about time in the right way. Time is limited, right? And to think that you have 40 hours a week for, let's say, 5 years left is probably not the actual thought that helps you to find the right levels of motivation and end up actually successful. You know, there's a good book, and maybe in the future episodes I'll actually talk about this book more, but there's a book called The Motivation Myth by Jeff Haden. And one of the points that he makes is that motivation is really not what we all know it to be. Usually what we think is, first we will have motivation and then we will do something. So we think motivation to be the thing that causes something to happen. We think it causes the result. But what Jeff says is that motivation is the result. So when you go and you have a small win, when you have some small success moment, that is what causes motivation, which is really interesting because that goes into the Nike just do it territory. You're basically saying, look, if you want motivation, if you're waiting for motivation and you want to start doing some good work once motivation hits, well, there's some dramatic irony here because motivation is going to hit when you actually achieve something. Not the other way around where you have motivation and that's why you achieve something. So when you think about it like that, it's interesting. What is a small win that you can have today, right? You shouldn't be thinking, oh, it's going to take 10,000 hours. So I don't know, I'll just kind of do some work. You shouldn't be thinking like that at all. The way in which you should be thinking is, well, I need to have a small win today. In fact, I need to have a small win in the next 2 hours. What is my win, right? And so when you start thinking more like that, you start trying to have better days. You start trying to have better sessions within the days. And when you see your own velocity of learning, when you see yourself getting better, you can now project into the future and think to yourself and really believe, hey, you know what? I'm actually getting so much better. I'm not stuck doing these CRUD apps over and over again. I'm actually getting better. I'm learning more detailed things, and I can see that it's a matter of time before somebody realizes how undervalued I am and whatnot. And so to think that you have 10,000 hours is usually not the thing that really motivates us to thinking about the short intensity of the 2-hour session that we're about to have right now. And if you think more along the lines of, I want to have a great 2-hour session right now, then the reward, the true motivation that is founded upon something that is actually of substance, this is something called, result. Like the learning result that you get makes you realize, you know what, I actually can become a software engineer. And when you feel that, you're going to do another 2 hours. And when you have those good hours that are adding up to something that is probably far less than 10,000 hours, well, then you're actually going to get what you want over the long run. Time is actually so important. How you see time. Let me point you to 2 more examples before we end this episode. For one, it's not enough to look at the aggregate and say, over a long period of time, I've kind of been doing this in low intensity, so surely I must be able to do it in high intensity over a shorter amount of time. That's not true at all. If you think about it, when we have an interview, like a technical round, maybe a short one where you have one problem, that might be 45 minutes, 1 hour. That's such a short amount of time. The question is, have you been practicing? Have you been focusing to a level where, once you have done, I don't know, let's say 4,000 hours, were they 4,000 hours of you also learning to become very focused during every single hour? Or were they 4,000 hours where you were actually learning to get less and less focused because you're just plugging in the time, right? You need to practice what you're going to perform, right? And so if you see this a lot of the times, if you have singers that are practicing in their bedrooms, but they're a little bit shy, don't want to disturb the neighbors or whatnot, what you practice in the environment in which you practice might actually affect more than you think, right? So just think about all the different situations. Maybe in the actual environment, you're in a room that's much bigger. Maybe you're competing for so many other audio signals out there. You're trying to captivate your audience. So maybe you need to project your voice way, way, way louder. And maybe you just don't get the practice that you really need. So once again, you really need to think about, what am I practicing? You should be practicing in a way where you have high intensity. Because if you're extremely focused, you can get more done in a week. So even if you get the job, why would you be the person to get promoted versus why would you be the person to get fired? This is all based off of how productive you are and in combination of other factors like, are you a great teammate and whatnot. But if you really think about it, there's no version of you getting better at something if you're not practicing exactly that very something. So if you're not practicing to get faster at something, then you won't in any way get faster per se. So just think about, for example, like the fact that, I'm 34. So, I have probably taken many steps, many actual, like when I'm walking, steps in my life. And I did a little research on this. It apparently is something like 2.5 million steps that you take in a year. So, maybe roughly that's like 85 million steps that I took in my life. And then I saw, what kind of number of steps a marathon runner has to actually take. And it was something on the order of 55,000 steps. So, there's no way that you would look at me and say, oh, but Mike has taken 85 million steps. So surely 55,000 steps is nothing. He must be a great marathon runner. Nobody thinks like that. And the reason why is that the time that you have a small window. And in that window, you have a much higher intensity. You can't have low intensity spread across a long period of time and hope to actually achieve the same thing as high intensity over a short period of time. You should actually think about it like this. Imagine that you need to build up a certain amount of understanding. If you can, so to speak, climb the hill, if you can climb that mountain to the pinnacle, then after that point, everything is it's so easy. You can roll right down. But if you can't really make it to the pinnacle in time and you get exhausted, think of it like a game where you actually have to go back down to the bottom of the mountain. And so there's no version of low intensity that'll crack the nut. Sometimes, if you did a low intensity thing where you try to understand a very heavily complicated, abstract mathematical concept, there's no version of low intensity where you don't crack it and you come back with low intensity again and try to start off where you stopped. If you want to crack it, you're going to have lots of high intensity until you actually achieve what you intended to achieve. And so again, are you getting better at having better performance in that very, very, very high intense moment of a very short time span? And if you do that, that time span is so rewarding that you are innately motivated. You are innately practicing what you want to be performing in an interview room and whatnot. And you're actually cracking through the plateaus that you would have. And again, 10,000 hours is not really helping you to think in the right way. I wouldn't want to say that 10,000 hour concept is actually guarantee hurting you, but it is our interpretation of 10,000 hours and that very concept. And the ways in which I see students tend to make the mistake is that if you have 10,000 hours, why don't we just procrastinate? Why don't we just take it low intensity? Because I'm going to devote 10,000 hours anyway. So low intensity should be building things up. But that's just not how, things work. Many a times we are actually doing the opposite. What we're actually having is a limited amount of time. And our ability to really crack that nut in that limited amount of time will determine our success. But it will also determine our motivation level for the next time around and the next time around. And that's the only reason why, and here's the crazy ironic part, that's the only reason why you would end up at your proverbial 10,000 hour mark. So we said a bunch of things in this podcast. And I think everything I said in this podcast is something that I must have said like 100 times to many, many people, because it is exactly the piece of advice that they really needed to hear and needed to benefit from. The first piece is, well, first and foremost, this idea of 10,000 hours, the way in which it can help you is to find some level of appreciation for difficult things, that it takes a long time, but not necessarily 10,000 hours. That's the first thing that we talked about. Second thing is that, depending on the complexity of the task, it could be shorter and it could be longer. Third thing that we talked about is it's not just the complexity of the task that determines if it's shorter or longer, that the entire thing is based off of Professor Ericsson's studies. And Professor Ericsson was the person who was most interested in how guidance and coaching from an expert can really, really help a person to take it beyond what we would call naive practice and more into the zone of deliberate practice, right? And so the idea that you need to get actual feedback, actual guidance from somebody that does know for you to be much better in 2 hours compared to 2 years of just casually getting better. So to speak, the blind cannot lead the blind. That kind of concept was also talked about. And in the last parts of it, we kind of talked about like the motivation myth, right? You will never get more motivated by thinking that you have a long period of time. In fact, you don't make any decisions across 10,000 hours. You make the decision based off of now. And right now, instead of thinking that there's 10,000 hours, so even if you mess up one of them, it's okay. The thing that really motivates you to do the next hour really well is to have a great hour right now. Because that gets you the success that you need. That gets you, as Jeff Haden would say, that dopamine hit. It makes you feel a lot better about the progress that you're making. Everything becomes more believable. And ironically, this is what really makes you want to do the second hour. You're not exercising your willpower to do the second hour because it's not something that you do despite failure. It's something that you do because of success. And so the fact that this 10,000 hour rule isn't really helping us to kind of nudge us in the right direction in terms of how should I behave right now? I should study with way more intensity. I should achieve something right now within this hour because that will help me to domino forward, so to speak. That concept was also visited. I urge you to really think about time in the exact way time actually is. Time is limited. So, next time you have your laptop, try not plugging it in. Try going on battery. Tell yourself that this laptop is actually going to shut down, and it's all about what you can achieve in the moment right now. Not 10,000 hours into the future, but the next hour right now. And if you do that, you will fundamentally become a better software engineer.